or a better way to put it, if you want to put here, what are the cultic structures out of which these group of people live? If you want to get hold of the cultic structures, then you would take a look at their religion. And then finally, if you want to get a hold of their language, you would go about taking a look at their philosophy. And I would submit to us that these are the elements that make up the human enterprise that we call cultic. Therefore, to know the structures of a group of people is to count on yourself grappling with these 5 areas of their existence, of their life. And you have seen how we have worked with the arts and the sciences. Here are the sciences and the arts, and how we have talked about here the en-soi and the pour-soi, and how in the whole area now, as we begin to move into this particular discipline, we're going to be dealing with the psychology on the side of the arts, and the arts proper on the side of the humanities, or on the side of the arts. And here we're going to be looking at the psychological images and the sociological images as we come at it from both poles, both the en-soi and the pour-soi, so to speak. Then we're going to take a look at just getting down, first of all, how you get a broad, comprehensive picture of this particular discipline. Again, we're not after the details. We're not after being professional psychologists or professional artists. What we're after is a broad, comprehensive clarity of the discipline, so that we can grasp ourselves in relationship to any data that comes out of it. How to get the simplicity that releases us in to receive the manifold number of data that are present. And we're also after methodologies whereby we can communicate with clarity those data that are present and can be brought to bear in that particular discipline. Then how can we get to the heart of a discipline and get at its interrelatedness and the images that hold the interrelatedness of that discipline into being? And then finally, how do you build up a Weltanschauung, so to speak? Now that Weltanschauung is always there, which means that our who we are is always out ahead of our grasping who we are as a community or as a society. Therefore, as we plumb the depths of this, we're after forging the authentic images out of that which is present and bringing them into being in order to determine the direction the trends go tomorrow. Now, to go back and to place this in the context of the total model that we have, I first of all want to draw the basic triangle, whereby, as you notice, that we take first of all the wisdom that is present, and then the structure of life that is present, and then that is utterly unsynonymous with any way in which you and I articulate or grasp what is going on. Here is the general life model. Now, to take the wisdom dimension of this, or the reflection pole, we would first of all come upon ourselves grasping the sciences, and then the humanities, and then the theological, as we spelled out the other day. Now, to go ahead and spell out these 2 poles of science, we find ourselves the psychological, the sociological dimension, and then the natural science. Then in the area of the humanities, those that parallel it, we would pick up the arts, then history, and finally philosophy. And as you know, we're talking about a model having to be, first of all, utterly comprehensive or inclusive, and inside of that be internally consistent or rationally consistent, then you can see that we would have to join here these 2 poles of the triangle, and these 2 poles of the triangle, and these 2 poles of the triangle, and carry that same consistency throughout the entire model that is there. Therefore, if this is correct, what we'll be taking up this time is the psychology and the arts, whereas the other time we had sociology and history. Now, with this, as we did with sociology and history, we're going to be spending 3 of our sessions with the sciences and only 1 with the humanities. We'll be spending 3 of our sessions with psychology and 1 with the arts. Now, in the area of psychology, we could first of all maybe take the non-therapeutic discipline. For example, first of all, you would have the behavioristic psychology, here of the way in which our motor controls work and out of which we live as a biological human being. And then you can take up field psychology that comes out of Lewin and others, in which the social relationship is laid out. And then you can take out the rational psychology of such things as learning theory, etc., and how the rational dimension is there in your non-therapeutic psychology. But this is not the dimension or the area that we want to work together in the few days that we'll be pushing in the area of psychology. We want to be pushing specifically into the area of therapeutic psychology. Therefore, we will take the biological pole today, and then tomorrow take the social pole, and then following day we'll pick up the rational pole. Now, instead of behavioristic field and learning, it'll be the biological as we pull it through Freud, sociological as we pull it through Hornheim, and the rational as we pull it through Frankl, or the various therapeutic disciplines of our time, at each one of these poles of therapeutic psychology. Now, with that then, we will have the biological to put it out in the timeline, social, and then the rational. Then, following that, we will pick up one section on the art. It's spelled out such as this. So this will be our time together on psychology and the arts. Now, one of the things that we find when we take a look at the whole dimension of the psyche, that we are in the midst of a transition, and that transition has come in the midst of our lives, even those that are the youngest of us here present. For example, we have just come out of an era whereby, as the psyche, we have been concerned for the psyche. In other words, we have been gearing all of our psychological wisdom in over against seeing ourselves and wrestling with ourselves as psychological animals. And as you might expect, this has been geared into the pole of the individual, or the pole of individuality, or the pole of what does it mean to be an individual or a self in an individual sense. The psyche has spent its energy looking at the psyche. This has been the collapse of the end of Western civilization. This has been a collapse of the modern period. This has been at the end of civilization of itself, going out of history. Now, mind you, we are in a brand new era. Call it whatever you want. The postmodern era, as Gene was calling it yesterday, or whatever. And we are coming into a new realm where now the sociological dimension is that which has come to the fore. That here is where we find the cutting edge of grasping ourselves in relationship to the civilizing process, even grasping ourselves into being able to articulate what it means to be a human being. And here, to take a look at psychology today, or the psyche, would be for the purpose of the psyche, looking at the sociological situation instead of the psyche itself back at this point, at the age that it's just collapsed and being evolved. So this is the shift that has taken place, and it's here that we want to gear. And it's for this purpose that we're taking up the whole dimension of the psyche. Now, if we're going to take a look at the psyche, I think we need to start maybe first of all here. Man is a thrust, whatever else he is. And he finds himself going through life with just a push. He's a push. He's a thrust. He's going out. Here's life for him as he thrusts out. Life for him as he thrusts out. But, you know, not only is man a thrust, but my Lord, he sees that he lives in a world that thrusts back. So forth. In other words, the world pushes back. And here, whereas this, you can call this death. And this is just the kind of the dynamics of the situation that he's in. Now, if you want to take here at the center, I don't know how, of man's being, at the center of life itself, or at the center of whatever goes on as you shove down to the deep, the abyss of whatever takes place. Here you find arrows, here you find energy, here you find thrust for life, the elan vital, here the primordial energy that bubbles up out of whatever goes. And we want to take a look at that as we go on. But as this comes out, it shoves out into the biological dimension here. and as it shuts down, it sees itself. The ego is formed, and it hits its limits. In other words, man is a biological trust. He's a group of appetites that thrusts out. But at every point, he sees his appetites cut off. He sees a nose. He bumps up against the limits of his appetites. He bumps up against the nose in the midst of his appetites. He bumps up against fate and death, to use the theological terms. And here, then, we want to take a look at the biological psychology, if you want to put it that way. Primarily Freud, or here, if you want to use the other word, of the appetites. And see the dynamics of the relationship of man who finds himself, this thrust, up against this particular limits that are present. But not only does man find himself with that kind of an onrushing out of the midst of his being into the history of the biological or the appetites, he sees himself also as that thrust which moves out into the sociological, if you want to put it this way. Or here, the thrust after acceptance. And my Lord, here I am. My neighbor is always moving in and out of my life, moving in and out of my life, moving in and out of my life. I've always seen myself moving out for acceptance, but rejection is there. I'm always moving out for a yes, but a no is there. I need acceptance in life, but there are limits that are there. And so, we take up the dynamics the next time. A man who finds himself in the midst of life, shoving out to grasp acceptance, but the limits present into the midst of his being. And here, whereas it's fear and death in the background, here it's guilt and condemnation, if you want to put it that way. Over here, it could be the libido thrust with its limitations here. And here with this, it could be the individual always in the midst of society or having to participate in whatever goes on. But this is not enough yet to talk about man. Not only is he this kind of explosion into the midst of whatever goes on, but also he finds himself out rationally, that his mind is thrust out in the midst of history. And so out of this deepness of the vitality of the thrust of life into history, he finds himself thrown out over here, rationally trying to grasp whatever is going on, trying to get over grasp experience. But he finds that his experience is always ahead of him. It's always outrunning his categories by which he grasps his experience. And he finds that he has to understand, he has to comprehend, but the limits that are there that finally he cannot ultimately understand, that he finally cannot ultimately comprehend. And so here, over against the rational, or the demand of the life images by which he can get hold of himself. Or here he's always over against meaninglessness and emptiness, to use Tilly. Or if you want to use Kierkegaard here he's over against finitude, but always infinitude, in the sense that he sees the rigidity here with the utter openness of the possibilities of his images. Well, here is the direction in which we'll be going. The man is this thrust. Life, they always are present, are limits, death, limits biologically, limits to his appetites, limits to sociological or to his acceptance, limits to his rational process or to his life images. And so here, then, we look at the dynamics. We'll try to see what it means to talk about hell. We'll see what it is that always a demand upon him to live in the real world and to get hold of his life that's there. Now, I'm going to pick up, as I mentioned, particularly here, Freud, and work on him. And first of all, I'd like to take a look at his anthropological insights, just to try to get a fiber of the sort of wealth of data, of new information, in the sense of the new information of the 20th century as the way he brought it into being. And then to quickly here look at the structure of the psyche as he drew it into history. And then thirdly, to take a look at therapy as he would see what this meant. And then fourthly, to see some of the implications of this for our time. Now, to come at the anthropological insights of Freud, it's almost, that he gives us so much that it just overwhelms you to grasp it. And yet, by virtue of living in the 20th century now, or since Freud, you might say, these last 75 years in the midst of a Freudian psychological world that's been woven into us. So every one of us, in one sense, know the insights that I'm going to list here, and yet what we want to do is just to bring them quickly into being for us, or quickly to expose ourselves to the insights that you might say that our culture has breathed out to us. First of all, know that here the insides is just, of course, the psychic determination. What we see here in this is that the causality in the midst of our psyche. That each psychic event, according to Freud, was just determined. And it's always here preceded by certain thoughts that, and all of our actions and thoughts here, even those that seem to be accidental, or even those, that seem to be misinterpreted, have a psychic causation. And in the midst of this psychic causation, the second one, which is utterly tied to it and cannot be separated, is the priority of the unconscious. For you see here, Freud turned everything around, and you can imagine the horrifying breaking open this was. Here was the end of the age of reason, so to speak. Here, a Western man came to the epitome of the age of rational thought, and suddenly Freud walks onto the plane of history and said, conscious thought is unusual. Rather, the regular characteristic of the mental process is unconscious thought. And whereas we thought that everything was exposed rationally, now, so to speak, thought was like an iceberg. 7/8 of it was below the conscious level. And now here, we had to come to terms with a brand new way of grasping ourselves. And in fact, these two hypotheses, in a way, could be held together to say that every behavioral pattern that man has a causal determinant. And most likely, that cause is unconsciously given to the situation, or is unconscious to the person that is acting out his psychic thrust. And then he picked up the libido here as the life force. And as you know, here for him, primarily this was sexual. And what he was doing here was eros. This was that which drove you on for the search for pleasure. And while it was primarily sexual in nature, he did not limit it just to sexual intercourse, of course, but shoved it into just the total dimension of man's biological life, and primarily pulled it through the whole area of pleasure. In other words, here it indicated the pleasure principle was that which thrust man out. And it was not just which was that which was sexual, but any way in which your feelings were motivating you now to seek that which was pleasurable, both in the social relationship or pleasurable to yourself back as an individual and a biologically oriented. Then with the libido here, and this is a later part of his theory, as we'll come back and look, is not only the eros, if you want to put it that way, or the life thrust, but here was an aggressive principle. And this aggressive principle here was the death force or thrust, the thanatos, to use the opposite of eros here, or the Greek word. In other words, you had the here, the death instinct over this. And as I say, this came later in Freud's life, in the 20s, actually, where he had spent many years now studying the masochistic and the statistic perversions in the midst of psychoanalysis. And now he came up with the death thrust in the midst of it. And now instead of that great force that was down here that I indicated a while ago of being the life force, it was just bursting out into history. This force had the ambiguity that was there, or the ambivalence which will come back later on. They both had the thanatos and the eros, and you could not finally separate these in any given situation. And these two drives were fused together in both the normal and the pathological individual. So whether you're clean psychologically or neurotically, or whether you're perverted, both of these thrusts are in the midst of every person. And both had the same capacity for fixation and also the same capacity for regression, as we'll come to in just a minute to elaborate on. Then here also he talked about the bisexuality of man, of human beings. In other words, there is no pristine male or pristine female, but every one of us see, like the feminine nature is in me, and just as much as the masculine nature in those of you that are biologically appear as feminine to mankind. In other words, here, both of these are running through each one of us. And the anxiety and the guilt that is present in our lives because we're aware of this in our lives. And any of you that have taken psychological tests have probably stumbled upon yourself, wondering where they have the masculine, feminine scale,
And, you know, if you end up, if you're a male for a moment, and you end up way up in the feminine side, you wonder, good Lord, am I queer, you know, really at heart or something like that. Or if you find that you're way down on the scale, you know, and you suppress the feminine, and you wonder, am I afraid I'm a queer, you know, this kind of Or if you end up 50-50, you know, good Lord, maybe I'm not really a male, you know, this kind of thing is there. So all this, you know, is going back. And then what Freud's insight is, no matter what's going on, they're in this kind of thing, because you're aware of this relationship, anxiety and guilt is present. And in sixth here is just the great ambivalence that is present in every one of our lives. And this is to pull back on the bipolarity of this point, of the thanatos and eros. For you see that every situation you have this bipolarity of your human emotions. And I never will forget talking with a woman one time and asking her which one of her children she liked the better. And she said, oh, I like them both the same. And, you know, you want to just say horse manure. Now, tell me, which one do you like the better? But you can't say it quite that blunt in many situations, so you dance around and ask it in another way. Oh, I like them both the same. And one of them walked into the room, and you could tell by the glance she hated this one's guts at that particular moment and was just gooing and slobbering over the other. But she could not allow herself to be present to this kind of ambivalence in the situation. And this is one of the things that Freud exposed to us about every relationship that we have. It has both present. And then the sublimation here is one that he laid out for us as his theory. In other words, the libido, the thrust that you have, the libido thrust that's there into the sexual nature, that through sublimation you can move this over to some other social or aspect of life that gratifies the libido in the same way that it would be if it was directly within the sexual thrust. And by sublimation, then, you can take that life force and move it out into other kinds of areas of life and operate just as normally or non-pathological as if you filled it up completely with a direct gratification that it would ordinarily demand. And Freud makes a statement that the whole superstructure of human civilization is built on his principle of sublimation. Then, eighthly here is displacement. And displacement for him, of course, is, that you run into a situation where pain comes, that now displacement takes place and a like situation comes into you that will not bring you physically pain, but the symbol out of that situation of the displacement brings you the pain. For some reason, I always have pain when I see a bald-headed man. Now, you can see the displacement that's there. You're either asleep or I've worn that out. I don't know which here. And it's the sexual development at this point. And in the sexual development here, we see, first of all, the oral stage. And I'm not going, you've all studied this in many different ways, either through jokes or through classrooms, but this is prior to 1 year of age. Then the anal stage, and this runs from 1 to 3. Then at this point you come into that phallic stage, which runs you up until about 13 years of age. Or whenever you move over into the genital, or that which is finally full growth over 13 or 14. Now, in the phallic stage, we run into a strange phenomenon that is a key in many ways to Freud's work. And this is the Oedipus period. And usually this is from 3 to 7. And the Oedipus period here is a strange one for Freud because it's this that he gets his dynamics out of. In other words, in this situation, I, as a young male, hate my father for his relationship to my mother, secretly dislusting after my mother, but scared to death of my father because if I carry out that libidinal thrust, I will be punished by castration. Therefore, the way that I get out of this is to line myself up with my father and identify myself with him in that situation, and thereby internalize out of his psyche his relationship to the thrusts of life. whereby you see I interject into human existence two responses. First of all is the response here of the ought. And the ought is now just present in life, and this ought gives me guilt. Because I'm always over against that ought, either striving to fulfill it and not fulfilling, always waking up that having said no to it. And this is conscious, a conscious part of me. Then there is another part in relationship to that, and that is feeling utterly insignificant, feeling utterly inferior. And this inferiority that I have out of it is unconscious. In the sense that I am bearing that in my relationship and refusing to be present to it. So that I'm always coming upon myself, violating my own values, you see. I always experience myself as a naughty boy, so to speak. Then, here to move on, and I want to come back to this and just briefly hit it from another angle. Here is another one, the latency period from 7 to 13, and this is a quiet period as part of sexual activity is concerned for Freud. Now, the last thing that's here, I think that we need to take a quick look at is fixation and regression. And this is important for Freud's later theory when we come back to see how he's going to be talking about it. But you see, here I am moving from this stage to this stage to this stage, finally to this stage. And where I become pathological is when I get fixed on a certain stage. I cannot deal with that situation. The libidinal thrust is so great and frightening that I hang on to this in order not to be able to deal with it. Or else over against that, the nose are so great that I hide from the nose the naughtiness and fix myself onto that so I will not have to face the future of growing and moving into the next stage. So here then you turn up to see illness where a person either resides in one of these ages when as his physical age is far beyond that. Or he can regress. Certain times in his life, boom, out bursts the horrifying emotional strain, and he reverts and regresses back to that. He can regress back to the oral stage by fighting, or drinking. Or he can regress back to the anal stage by being a miser, as an illustration. Or he can revert back to the phallic stage, here by having just a phobia of snakes, being scared of it. What I never have understood about Freud is how in the hell a 45-year-old man can be in all three stages at once. This is the difficulty. Now, we need to take You're getting a little bit more awake there. I don't know. Now let's take a look at the structure of his psyche. And this is, as you know, late in Freud's life that the pristine structure that you have in your paper came. For example, the first part, as we see here, was where he had the telescope hypothesis. This was around 1900. And as far as I know, this was completely thrown out, although he drew and used that as a stepping stone to move on. And the telescope, one end he had the perceptual system, and on the other hand he had the motor controls. And between the perception and the motor controls, he had all sorts of systems going through that. So, between that and the motor controls, many things would happen. But so at this point, the wish fulfillment was the main structure of his thrust. And here you were always between tension of unpleasure and gratification or pleasure. And you were always seeking to release that tension and fulfillment with pleasure, and fulfill it with pleasure. Then around 1913, he came into the topographical theory of the unconscious, or the mind. And here you'll notice that which he appropriated later on. There were three here. You had the unconscious, you had the preconscious, and then finally you had the conscious. And this, of course, he kept later on. Now, to come to the third theory here, this is the structural theory or hypothesis of man's mind, and whereas this was 1900, 1913, this is 1923 here.
And the structural theory worked something like this.
Man was made up of three parts. First of all, we find that you have the id. The id, here let me draw the circle, is this part that's just that blind, irrational part, out of which both the ego and the superego come. It is that which forms every other dynamic relationship of the psyche. And here the psyche represents both the eros and the thanatos. Here the id is the bubbling of both of these. And out of this bubble your ego and your superego. In other words, here is pure irrational thrust. Here is pure life-death force. And the only thing here it's subordinated to is the pleasure principle, or the pleasure-death principle, finally. But the pleasure principle overhand finally holding man into being. Now, mind you, this is there from the beginning of life, whenever that baby first appears upon the stage of history. Then, at the age of 6 months, the ego begins to come into being. And the reason for this is that here, this thrust that this baby is bumps up against the nose, or bumps up against the limits. And now, it must negotiate with those limits. It must finally, some way, handle those limits or the nose that are over against it. And the ego mechanism comes up against this. In other words, it begins to distinguish between those id impulses, so to speak, which gratifies it and which negates it, or which frustrates it. And in other words, here is the dimension of the I. Here is the dimension of the self. Here is the dimension of that aspect of the personality that it perceives and knows, or the rational dimension, or however you want to talk about it. Then along here is the ego. Let me draw the ego a little bit down below the conscious, and you can put this area here, the pre-conscious, if you want, because it is in that twilight between the unconscious and the conscious. The pre-conscious can be called up with certain psychic activity into the conscious. The unconscious cannot directly. Then here is the superego, and by far the main part of the superego is in the unconscious realm also, but also part of it in the conscious. And the superego comes about around the age of 5 or 6 years. And in its development, it grows out of the id, and it comes into being as a result of this edible complex that I was mentioning a while ago. In other words, up to 5 or 6 years of age, the kid just simply runs into, he's like Pavlov, like the rat in the maze. Or the dog. He bumps up here, if that gratifies him, fine. If he bumps here, and this gratifies him more than that, then he goes to this. And this is just a purely a yes and no. But after this point of 5 or 6 years, when the edible complex comes into it, you can see the great mythological statement that he has here of how he internalizes the no, how he internalizes the culture through, in the case of a male, he internalizes his papa's psychic relationship. And because he's frightened at his impulse of his desire to kill his papa, again, to restate it, and yet at the same time, if he did do that, how could he stand the psychic energy and also the threat of being castrated? Therefore, finally, join your papa. And in joining that, you internalize your parent, so to speak, or you internalize the mores of society as they have come through your parent. So the superego comes into being. And you see, the superego doesn't come in now as just to an isolated one-and-one yes and no. It comes into being as a whole dimension of a network of mores, of traditions and demands. And now this is largely unconscious, as I mentioned. And here you sort of have the unconscious law that has come through the internalized parent. And this unconscious law is sort of like now ever sleeping sensor. It's like Big Brother, you know. He peers out at you at every point. He's supervising every activity of the ego and the id. He's looking at everything that's taking place, and he's ready to jump out and pounce on you if you cut over across him. Or he's ready to come out and pat you on the head and give you self-love and give you self-gratification as you operate in the proper way of releasing what is to be released through the ego. So you can see here the great poetry that he's given to us. Now, I want to hold a little bit of this till we get to therapy. But as you know, Freud, first of all, was mainly preoccupied with the unconscious. After his development here of the structure of the ego, Freud shifted in the whole area of his therapy. And hell, there were still a bunch of Freudians back here that never had given up the other, and to this day there are a bunch of them that never given it up. But Freud shifted. And where he shifted is, he began to work with the structure of the ego. Hell, that way, that dance of the unconscious is back there when you got hung up in the ego period in childhood is still there, and he will deal with that. But it's here, primarily, the way the ego operates in relationships, that something must be done. So let's take a quick look, and I want to just hit you here with a whole batch of data on the ego, so you can get a feel after how it comes about. In other words, the ego is the Band-Aid dispenser, in one sense. It is the adjusting way of adjusting here at this point when it's used pathologically. But what I want to spell out as resistances here are defense mechanisms take place both in the normal person as well as in the pathological person. And first of all, of course, is just repression. Here. This is the kind of thing where, you just hold the id down, so to speak. You're not about to let that come into consciousness, and you just keep on running, holding it down, holding it down, holding it down. Then second is rationalization. I had to get him fired because he almost stepped on that ant in the sidewalk when he was walking down the street, or something like that. Some way to justify yourself for what you're doing, or to make up something that would be acceptable to you in that situation. Then, thirdly here, there is projection. You project onto the other person here what you want now, or relocate in that person what may be taking place. In other words, if you have certain fears that you can't come to terms with in a situation, then you project those fears out into a situation to create a boogeyman, so to speak, so those fears then can come back at you. It's sort of like how we do the Negro, we turn the Negro into every Negro is such and such. We project, our fears on, or the uneducated in another society or whatever. Then there's introversion here, introjection, excuse me. And this comes about, where you project onto someone, you become a great movie actor. You become Errol Flynn, so you can sex it up all over the place with all the people in your mind because you're scared to death of sexing it up yourself personally or something like that. You use strictly the Freudian chronology. Then regression, I've already mentioned here, where you go back and hide. You want to become a little child and remain a little child for the rest of your life, and you just hit any of us in our gizzards, and we can throw a temper tantrum just like any little child, And mind you, we use sophisticated, culturally accepted ways for being little children, so all of us know what we're doing. Then we have a sixth here, the turning against oneself. And this is when I beat myself over the head. Oh, I've been naughty. Oh, this kind of, isn't this horrible, Oh, I want to just beat hell out of somebody, and I can't do it, and I get scared, so I come back and beat myself, or something like this. And then seventhly, here is the isolation of effect, I can't stand something, can't deal with it, therefore I'll box it up and shift over here to where it's easy to handle, and I won't have to come out and face it head on. In other words, I maybe will repress an emotion out of a past event, and therefore deal the emotion over here, and not have to face the past event out of that which originally gave me this particular emotion. Then, of course, allied with this is thought disassociation. They're the same kind of thing, in much the same way, in which, I'll just blank things out momentarily. I turn the fogging machine on, and I just turn it up so I won't be present to what can't see, this kind of thing. Then there's reaction formation. My Lord, he sure can spell these out, can he? Just keep piling them up. Here, this is, if you hate someone, now the best way to kill them is with kindness, you just smother them. You take them flowers, You tell them what great people they are, and such things as this, You just kill them by the reverse procedure. And then, of course, the last one is just the overt denial of reality. It ain't that way. I just don't see it. And I think I mentioned in our Guernica discussion there about how we had a woman in one of our seminars that could not see the dead baby in Guernica. Just could not see it. And the whole class was shouting, "There it is, over to the left, down there. See where?" No, can't see. Just a denial of reality. Well, you say we've got enough Freudianism woven into us in the 20th century to know what was going on there when she could not see that baby. Now, this is important because here is where today he is shifting. Today, the latter part. In other words, he's shifted from the psychology of the id, if you want to put it that way, to the psychology of the ego, and primarily began to deal in this dimension with the ego, of altering the ego mechanism in order to get at therapy. Now, I want to come head on at therapy for a moment, please, and I want to intermix these two as the way he intermixed them, and yet probably try to draw some distinction of them at the end. First is catharsis. Catharsis, as you know, was just talking something out. Freud started this, but by 1890 he had given it up. He talked with people in a hypnotic stage. He would hypnotize them and then have them spill out their guts, so to speak, and get an emotional catharsis. Now, Freud gave this up in 1890. The hell, we're still hanging on to it. But he gave it up in 1890, either by hypnosis or direct talking. In its place, he began to use free association. And you know, here that while you're on the couch, the therapist would get behind you and then punch your talking button, and you just begin to bubble out. Anything that came to mind, you just let it bubble out. And then the therapist, being skilled as he was, would reach in and begin to grab this and that about your childhood to know where you were fixated at some particular point. And by the symbols that came up, he would be able to work with these. But along came his discovery of dreams. And my Lord, here, now what a boon this was to free association. Because you see, the therapist, in the beginning sense, would not enter into conversation with the patient except to unblock him or release him to free associate a little bit better. But now he picked up the tool of dreams that would just shove free association way on down the line. Because what you had here, you see now, was just all sorts of material in relationship to the unconscious feeling, or to the place where you were blocked. And now, out of building up certain kinds of symbolic objects that just represented certain things, my Lord, quickly, by virtue of working with dreams, you could find all ways by which people now are relating to the real word out of these symbolic objects that they would bring up in their dreams. Then, along with this, was a slip and the wit. People are all the time making fun of us and make some joke and this kind of thing. But if you go back, as you know, to his primary hypotheses there, that everything is causally determined and probably it's unknown. You can see that the kind of joke I tell tells you who I am. And so, and you can see a guy get in a tight situation, and he'll spill out a funny. He just revealed himself, right down the bottom. Or the slip. And you remember one of Freud's classical things here that he talked about a man walking down the street and a girl walking down the other side of the street, and he said to the man walking with him, he said, "What's that girl's name?" And he looked at it and said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You're going to marry her next week. Don't you know who she is?" Well, you can see there, Freudianly, what was going on. Just utter rejection of his anticipated bride. Well, here, by these things, you see, these are also ways in which they can call into being what's needed. Then the next shift, in a way, is here in transference. And this is a very part of the whoop and the wharf. This would be the whoop, and this is the wharf of Freudian therapy. In one sense, this is what they call the dual axis. Here, of pulling up out where the emotional blocks are, and then having here the therapist become, if you want to put it this way, the papa who is now in an objective situation, and you can transfer to him your hate and your love. And then out of this new relationship in a structured objective situation, you can now come to terms with a situation that you haven't been able to come to terms with prior to this. And so therapy takes what place. So more and more, as Freud moves on, the objective situation was there, and the objective presence to the problem by the therapist himself was part of the situation. Then also here you had that objective person. Let me get that down secondly. And then third, homework. And Freud here, especially, began here to get people to work on their external symptoms. At the same time, he was dealing with the internal causes. They had something to push back at outside, so to speak, in the external manifestations of what the internal causes were throwing into being. Now, again, we need to see that his shift was here from primarily a dwelling on the unconscious here to the ego over here. And primarily here, he was placing more and more emphasis on resistance or the ego defense in order now in the transference situation to allow that ego defense to be broken up and new possibilities to take place for the therapist, for the patient. Now the implications of this. Theologically, my Lord, what a tool this has given us in our day for sin. We see man here, psychological tools coming out, how we just again and again and again, man has refused to face life how it actually is. And as he refused to meet the limits, as the limits have appeared to him or pumped up to him in the situation. The refusal of the limits, the denial of reality, the not relating of the self to the self. All of this modern-day psychology has given us tools to work over against it. And the classical example of this is the paper You Are Accepted, where Tillich took depth psychology, and certainly through the first two parts, the separation from others and oneself. Here is just a classical example of this tool being used. Mind you, when he throws it over against the ground of being, he shifts into the ontological here and moves into that kind of a grounding. But you can see the great tool it has been. And up to this time in the theological dialogue, we have used psychological tools to articulate sin and to articulate self-will. Now, mind you, that's shifting today, but we can see what a great tool and a gift this has been to us in our time. And my Lord, also the whole area of God, or the limits here, has just been given back to us. The pressures, the moving in upon of our lives, the moving in upon of our lives. All along we see that this is just there, that this is there. And the problem is, at this point, can we take the anxiety upon ourselves? If we do not, we destroy ourselves. In other words, the question is this anxiety-producing situation the Lord, or the gift of my Father, or is this something else here? And finally, this decision has to be made. Now, to come back maybe to the implications, and first I just want to shotgun a little bit here, but in our time, what he's done is just shown neurotic anxiety in a way that has allowed us to see man is an anxious animal existentially. Or to put it another way, man has anxiety that's rooted in the very deeps of his being, of a part of being human. But we can also see now that there is neurotic anxiety of where man refuses to be the existential anxiety that he has. Then he has his neurotic anxiety on his hands to deal with. And then we see that the pressures that belch out into our neuroses into consciousness, and the kind of thing here, the new tools, that this has come about here with this. And the ways in which that we can deal with the interpersonal relationships. We can deal with the outbursts and the hostilities in the midst of life. And then with that, because everything has an understanding of the self, whether it's that of Freud or all the later model builders that came upon them, what it means finally to have self-awareness and how to grasp yourself as a psychological animal, and then finally beyond that to the spirit animal. Then the relational attitudes that we take to ourselves in that spirit, this is given back to us in a new kind of model. Then we have seen that moralism had been broken by this particular discipline, probably more than any other discipline in our time. And what a great tool this has been. And how this again and again in our day is just demanded over and over and over that you and I take another look at life other than through the glances of moralism. And as sect and as a psychologist have done more to blast that open for our age than probably anything else. And here, just a great hammer blow this has been on moralism. Then also we've seen the insights of how a discipline is both a reflection of and an internalization in culture, and how that everybody today, if you want to put it, is a Freudian by virtue of just living in our culture, and what one man has done, so to speak, by giving a model to society, and how that whole society internalizes that model or that understanding in its very being. And then also we have to take a look at love. That you and I, and because of Freud, can never look at the word love in the pre-Freudian time through the same eyes, through the same glasses. And here I mean erotic love and phileo love, as well as, of course, our own understanding of love out of the Christian faith. And also we've seen that here that we have taken his great model. And because he had the great clothes of 19th century mechanistic determinism upon him, that we have used this to ooze through life. That we found an excuse that we're neurotic. Therefore, you couldn't expect us to live our lives. And we've grasped hold of the very insight itself and perverted it in order to keep ourselves from having to rise up to live in the midst of this world. But probably most of all, what this has done for our time is that here a man who was truly a man of the modern world, that is, a man who took and looked at data through the eyes of the 20th century data gathering, phenomenological understanding of just gathering empirical data, pulled into being what he saw. He dared to see what he saw and know what he knew, and not to flinch because of models that had gone down the drain, or because of systems that people said should have been, but because he dared to stand in the midst of this kind of a world, and they're out of the stuff of nothingness. And I do not mean by nothingness arithmetic zero, but I mean out of the stuff of daring to stand and create a brand new model at the edge of the civilizing process with these rational model that he had, a new understanding of the psyche that's delivered us into a brand new realm of understanding what it means to be a human person. And because of a man that was willing to stand on the edge and stand before that not yet and dare to create a model that brought into being the future and determined the whole direction of 20th century theology, you and I have a brand new possibility of being human beings. Now the question is on us, along with Freud, with the biological and the later modifications of where this was reduced with the sociological and the later modifications of where this is reduced with the rational. You and I have then to come to terms with the trend of this kind of going on that's in the area of the psyche, and then with that wisdom take our model and inject it in the midst of history. And although, to speak mythologically, the Lord has allowed us to see what Freud has not seen, He's given us a model of this man creating a model to dare to have the same kind of courage as we face the future and the not yet, to weld into being out of the stuff of the givenness of our time that which is necessary for humanness tomorrow. Well, let us end.